It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce Sonia Tuma. I've known her, since the 1990s. We both got involved with the American Friends Service Committee about the same time. I was a volunteer and she was very active at that time with Middle East program, I believe. She is now the regional director for the Western third of the U.S. And that program advocates for ending militarism and immigration reform and ending mass incarceration and many other issues. So she's been a researcher, educator, organizer, and activist for 25 years. And she's a trained mediator and facilitator. And I think we're really fortunate to have her here today, sharing what the AFSC is doing and a little bit about herself. Sonia, could you share a little bit also about how you came to work for the AFSC, a little bit about your spiritual journey, since we're a faith-based group. So take it away, Sonia. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and also from Spencer.
Thanks, Anthony. There are a number of names and faces here that I recognize mostly from sort of back in the day. As Anthony referenced, I was first an intern or a fellow for the service committee and volunteer for a while, but I staffed the AFSC Middle East Peace Education Program for about 8 years in the 90s to the early 2000s. And so there are actually a couple of people on this call that I worked with during that period of time. So it's good to see faces again. So a little bit about me and I'll do some kind of spiritual journey stuff and then my journey to the service committee. So I can tell you that I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm a native, and my parents are of different religious and cultural backgrounds, and that very much shapes both my spiritual journey and I think a lot about my identity and what brought me to the service committee and what brought me ultimately actually to Quakers. My dad was an Iraqi Muslim and my mom a Russian Jew, and I was born in 1967. It's a pretty auspicious year to be born in the time of thinking about Arab-Jewish relations. And that really shaped a lot, I think, of my family experience and of my childhood. So there's some markers that I think are actually pretty important. So as I said, I come from this interfaith background. Both of my parents come from very religious families, and neither one of them actually were particularly religious. So I grew up in a family with a lot of spirituality, but without a lot of organized religion. And I would say that I actually still am most comfortable in that realm. But because I grew up with family that were so committed to their faith, I have a real kinship with people who base a lot of their value in their work from a faith background. It's a place where I feel pretty comfortable, and a lot of my organizing has really been with people of faith and in interfaith communities through the years. So I do feel among friends here for sure. I came to, so as I said, I was born in '67. I really came to a certain consciousness when the hostages got taken in Iran about what it meant to be Arab American in the U.S. Because before that, I think there was not a lot of real, people didn't know much about the Middle East in any concrete way. And the first introduction for a lot of Americans to the Middle East was actually the taking of the hostages in Iran. And I have family in Iran and family in Iraq. Lots of people, my family is Shia Muslim, and so there are a lot of Shias who have family in both Iran and Iraq. I'm not unusual in that way. So I can tell you that it all felt pretty jarring at that point, because there was this a sudden sort of animus about people like me and people like my family that I really didn't have a lot of understanding for as a kid. And it shaped, I think, a certain interest of mine in terms of really doing educational work about what the experience of people in the Middle East was. So I went on to study international relations and actually did graduate work in international economics and international relations. And I did a lot of research and writing about Arab feminist movements and the role that nationalism plays in essentially undermining feminist movements. It's not only true in the Arab world, that's actually true all over the world. I started doing a lot of work related to Palestine when I was in school, and I actually met the service committee during that work. I was born and raised here, as I said, and there's not that many Quakers in the West Coast, so I didn't know much about Quakers, and I really didn't know anything at all about the service committee. I came to the service committee to do Middle East peace education work because the AFSC was doing it, not because I had any connection to Quakers or the AFSC. And I do think that's how many, many, many people meet the AFSC. It's probably how most of you met the AFSC. Not necessarily Middle East work, but you were interested. Oh, somebody is unmuted. But you were interested in a particular issue, and you found a partnership, or you found a partner at that table from the service committee. And I think that a number of people actually meet Quakers through their affiliation with the service committee. Certainly that's how I met Quakers. I attended Quaker meeting for at least 20 years before I actually joined the meeting a few years ago, which is a really, I think, a beautiful thing about Quaker meetings, where there is this kind of real tolerance for allowing people to really be sure. And as I said, because I come from this background that is explicitly non-Christian, it was a real decision for me to determine whether or not I would actually join a Quaker meeting. I think for people who grow up in organized religion, or they grow up in Christian circles, it feels easier. It was actually a pretty big decision for me. But I came to AFSC in 1993, and most of my social justice organizing work at that point had been Middle East related. And I did some work with an organization called the Middle East Children's Alliance. Some of you who have done Middle East work or know Palestine stuff maybe know Mecca. So I worked with Mecca in the Bay Area, and came back home to Southern California and started working with AFSC. And my work with AFSC in Middle East programming was a lot about Palestine and the occupation and country's objectors in Israel, and looking at U.S. policy related to Israel and Palestine, and increasingly at that time about the U.S. role in the sanctions regime in Iraq, and what the disastrous impact of the sanctions were on the Iraqi people. AFSC did a lot of work on that, and it was an interesting arc to see a real change in public opinion over time. I mean, I think that quote about the arc of justice, I could see that really happening in the perception around sanctions work, the U.S. sanctions against Iraq at that time. When AFSC first started to do that work, even among people who were pacifists, sanctions seemed like a really good idea because they were an alternative to war. But then when we started to see the impact of sanctions, we could see that, in fact, they were having some of the same sorts of consequences that an active war might have. So I'm going to use that as sort of a jumping off point to talk about the AFSC more broadly. I'm going to start the slideshow, and that is going to require me to share my screen here. So I'm going to jump into a little bit of background about the AFSC and where we are right now. We've actually just begun implementing. We've been through a pretty lengthy strategic planning process. This is a global process that really looked with our staff and partners around the world at what some of the most crucial issues are that communities are dealing with right now. And it's a long-range strategic plan, 10 years. And so what you're going to see in the early part of my slideshow is the things that we have committed to organizationally, broadly, globally, for the next 10 years, including 3 different program areas and some particular methodologies that we are committed to using. And then I'm going to talk about some specific programming that we're doing here in the Western U.S. related to that. So let me jump into the slideshow. Thank you. So there's lots of folks on the phone who know about the AFSC. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about the history of the AFSC. Just a little bit, just to say, and we celebrated our 100th birthday in 2017, and so we're 104 now, and looking pretty spry for 104, I have to say. And as I said, we took this opportunity to do a new strategic plan, which included a new mission, vision, and value statement. So I just am putting up some mission and vision stuff as by way of real introduction of the Service Committee. So I'm not going to read slides to you. I will let you do that yourself, but essentially we are guided by Quaker principles in the belief in that of God in every person, and we work with communities and partners around the globe to look at systemic changes to promote lasting peace. You'll note that I really hit the word systemic there, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So our work is really based on a set of values that are inherently Quaker, but not only Quaker, and that is really understanding the worth of everybody, regarding no person as our enemy, and that is really challenging in the work that we do. Looking to be in right relationship with the earth, and looking more at environmental issues and environmental justice issues in the next century of our work. Understanding that we get our best experience, we understand the world best by not only living our own lived experience, but understanding that lived experience of other people. We have an incomplete truth. We are listening for what God has to say, and we are listening to the experiences of other people and how they experience systems, particularly systems of injustice. And we trust the Spirit to guide the discernment of our collective actions, and assert that love absolutely has a transforming power, and that active nonviolence is the force we will use for justice and reconciliation. So AFSC, as I said, began a little more than 100 years ago during World War I as really an organization that was built to provide alternative service opportunities for people, Quakers and others who were pacifists during the First World War. So people came to the AFSC and they were part of an ambulance corps, they did feeding programs. So they served their military responsibility, but they did it in non-military ways. AFSC has a global reach. We're in the U.S. and we're 17 countries and 32 cities around the U.S. right now, all with about 350 people. And so the thing to say about that, 350 staff people. So in order to have a global reach with 350 staff people, you've really got to have great community connections and volunteers. It's simply not possible to do the work that we do in isolation. So we work with partners and volunteers all over the world. So this is a really important understanding here that peace and justice are deeply entwined. So for much of the life of the Service Committee, in fact, all the life of the Service Committee, we've been known as a peace organization. That's how people see us. And that's how we see ourselves. But the thing that I want to be very clear about is that, and you know, you're a group who gets this, but really the notion that justice is required for lasting peace, that justice and peace are deeply intertwined, is really crucial in the work that we do and in the work that most of you do as well. And so when I talked just a minute ago about those kind of systemic approaches to peace building, it's really about understanding that there's this Quaker idea about taking away the occasion for war. And that's what people often cite as kind of the basis for peace work. And the idea is that you're not just doing anti-war work, you're doing all of that work that stops violence before it starts, right? And so looking for us in the kind of current environment that we're all living in, that means that there's an enormous number of barriers that people face to living with dignity and to living with equity. And so a lot of our work is really about dismantling those barriers and stopping the use of state violence and upholding human dignity and equality. So the overarching goal for the AFSC's work is really, as I said, it's about working with partners and volunteers around the world to secure and sustain transformative shifts in systems of power, with the understanding that that reduces violence and advances human dignity and equality. So what does that mean for what we actually do, right? So those are a lot of the how and why we do things, what it is we're trying to accomplish. But in terms of all of the possible things that an organization like ours could do in the world to promote these kind of the end of systemic, to try and stop systemic inequality and injustice, we've chosen 3 program foci for the next 10 years. And they're labeled here as just and sustainable peace, just economies, and just responses to forced displacement and migration. So really looking at a sustainable peace and all that's required to get there, economic justice, and displacement and migration issues. And we're doing it by the use of not only, but there are 4 core methods that we're really promoting in our work. And remember, we're a global organization, so we talk a lot in the US about community organizing. It's hard as essentially a guest in another country to talk about and do community organizing in a global sense. So we do a lot of what's called civil society strengthening. So working with civil society organizations in other countries to build their strength, help do development of those civil society organizations so that they can do organizing and community development work in their own countries. In the US, it looks a lot like community organizing that most of you would recognize as things that people have been doing for the better part of 50 years. We're also looking at research and analysis. Somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was Teresa talked about having worked with Dalit and Noam in AFSC's economic activism program. I'm going to talk specifically about the economic activism program a little bit later. So that research and analysis piece is very much one of the methods that we use and have used for a long time at the AFSC, to do research on an issue and to share that research with community organizers and social change movements. Research not for research's sake. We're not an academic institution. It's not what we're trying to do, but we're trying to arm social justice movements with the information they need to do good advocacy for social change. And there's lots of ways to do that and lots of avenues. The one I'll talk about today is economic activism. We do a lot of bridging and convening, and that means bringing people together. And it looks like lots of different things in lots of different places. So on a community level in Los Angeles, it may mean bringing people together. I'll talk about the garden program in South LA, and it means that we convene families in South LA to talk about what their experience with the housing authority has been in Los Angeles. Convening impacted people. It also looks like bridging, and that means bringing people together across a certain kind of either real or imagined divide. I'd say, one good example of that bridging work. So AFSC has, along with Quakers in Europe, we have access to the UN. We have an observer seat at the UN, and we have something called the Quaker United Nations Office. And one of the things that we do for bridging is actually provide a safe space for diplomats to speak behind the scenes, so they can have conversations that they couldn't have otherwise. And so that kind of providing a space for quiet diplomacy, for conversations to happen that could not happen without somebody providing an infrastructure for that bridge to be built. And the fourth core method is advocacy. And lots of you do advocacy. I heard Steve Brody just talk about it now with legislative stuff on the death penalty. That's about really trying to make policy level change. And policy level change advocacy work can happen at a city level, a county level, a state level, national level. It can happen in global organizations like the UN level, advocacy at all levels. So those are the 4 core methods. So here's the one thing I'm really excited about in my slideshow. I'm going to give you graphics. So look, there's the West region, and ta-da, there you go. That's the sum total of my the fun part of the slideshow. So the work I'm going to talk with you about today is the work over on the green side there in the West region. So AFSC's work in the U.S. is divided up into 4 different domestic regions in the U.S. We have 4 international regions, 4 U.S. regions, because we have so many programs in the U.S. So I work with AFSC's programming in the West region. I also do strategic planning work with programs in other parts of the country and internationally. But my actual job is the director of AFSC's programming in the West. And there are 10 different programs in the West region. They're in Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, 4 in California, and 1 in Oregon. So I'm going to talk with you about some of the specific work that we do in a minute now. So the 3 programs I'm going to talk with you about in the West region today are the local program in Los Angeles, which is called the LA Roots for Peace program. Shout out to Phil Way, who actually did some very concrete work helping us build the raised bed.
Sorry.
Did somebody mute? Maggie, can you mute, please?
I'm trying.
Thanks. There we go. So that's what I'll label here as a Just Economies program. A program that is looking at the just responses to forced displacement and migration is AFSC's U.S.-Mexico border program at the border in San Diego. And then I'm going to talk about one of our programs that really works from a methods place, which is the research and analysis piece. That's the economic activism program that I just referenced a few minutes ago. So I'll jump right into talking about those programs. So the LA Roots for Peace program is based in South LA. AFSC actually had an office in downtown. We have closed our office. We're working remotely, as most folks are, and our lease was up, and there was no reason for us to be paying rent on space in downtown LA when nobody was using it. So we have a little tiny spot in South LA for some office equipment, but most of our staff are working from home, and we have this program in Los Angeles, which is really looking at economic justice issues through food and access to healthy food and community systems that are really looking at sort of sustainable practices in communities. So the goal of the LA Roots program is to increase access to healthy foods, improve wellness, and support self-determination. And they're using 3 methodologies here. There are 3 methods, and one is urban farming, and I'll talk some about that, about the South LA Farm and Mar Vista Gardens in just a minute. Leadership development, and it's really it's intergenerational, but I will say there is more work with youth at this point. And I'll talk just a little bit about that, and the civic engagement work, which is really connected to that leadership development work. It's kind of a pipeline for civic engagement. So I'll start with the South LA Farm, and one of the things that I love to talk about with this particular farm is if you take a look at this picture on your screen, you'll see that it's surrounded by buildings, office buildings, houses. This is a spot in South Central LA, across from a community center with which we partner, and it was a parking lot. We unpaved the parking lot and built paradise. That's my favorite line about this program. So I'm really glad you gave me an opportunity to use it today. Thank you. This was a parking lot that sat empty, and we worked with community partners and the city to be able to essentially reclaim this and build a place for families and the community to grow their own food in South LA. So we had been working with All People's Community Center to do some community gardens around the community center, which, as I said, is just across the street. They had limited land. It's a building that actually takes up most of the space there. And this empty parking lot was really just across the street. And so we had our eye on it, and the staff set a 5-year plan. Aisha worked with that program, so big shout out to Aisha Mason. I can't see participants, but I hope she's smiling. Who worked with the LA program to actually achieve this goal, to realize this goal of reclaiming this parking lot, and that required, as I said, a lot of partnerships. So there's a lease for this. There's a program that AFSC did advocacy for a farming zone that allows people who turn unused land in the city into kind of these kind of farming enterprises, social good enterprises. They get a tax break, and that allowed us to get a 50-year lease on this land and break up the blacktop and do soil remediation, and it took quite a lot of time. And you'll see, I think, the next photo. So we're now in year 3 of this farm, and we're actually expanding the usage of the farm. As I said earlier, shout out to Phil Way, who helped build some of these raised beds. So if you look in the drawing that's on top there, you'll see the numbered plots are raised beds. As I said, there were lots of areas there that we couldn't actually grow directly into the ground because it had been a parking lot, right? So there was a fair amount of soil remediation that we had to do. And Phil helped build those raised beds. And this farm actually feeds 13 families. And there's a community garden. So there's 13 families who are farming, and there's a youth group that's also doing a community garden here. So a lot of food is being grown here and brought into communities in South LA. So what you see here, just some pictures of some of the food that's being grown, and actually some people who are farming in masks. That's a fairly recent picture. And the bottom left actually shows a mural. The garden, if you're ever able to visit it, it is a magical place, really. It's got trellises and murals, and it's a physically beautiful place, visually beautiful place, but it also has an amazing feeling about it, because this is a place that the community has really invested. We are now really trying to figure out, so what's the future of this? And at some point, the reason why I included the schematic here is that at some point there was an initial, early on, there was an initial idea to actually have part of the garden that produced food that would then be sold at a farm stand, be kind of an income producing part of the program. What we learned actually from other groups that had done urban farming was that it wasn't sustainable, right? That building that kind of income generating thing didn't work particularly well. So they built this schematic out to actually increase the number of families who could farm there. So one of the things to say about this program is that it's really like, it involves a lot of community voices, and it's also really a lot about a certain kind of self-determination, connection to the land that is very different. So a lot of folks who come to South LA has transitioned to be a place, and most of the folks that we work with are Latinx. And a lot of those folks come from agricultural farming communities from the places that they come from. So they are used to being able to grow traditional foods, which are hard to find. And they've also found themselves in communities where there is very little access to fresh food. So being able to not only grow appropriate crops, but to grow crops that are actually difficult to find in South LA, where there is, still a food desert, even after years of advocacy, has actually proved really important for these communities. We have to figure out what happens next in terms of AFSC won't always run this farm. So we have a 5-year plan to transition the farm really to the community. And that looks a lot like AFSC providing a lot of infrastructure, as we have in the building of the farm, early on in developing all of the infrastructure for families to come together, building a kind of cooperative group of leaders who essentially run it. And by the end of the 5 years, our goal is to actually hand it over to local folks. And I'll use the farming work, the gardening work that we've done in Mar Vista Gardens in Culver City. Mar Vista Gardens is a housing project in Culver City, and AFSC did community gardens, built community gardens there a number of years ago. And that work was not just about building the garden itself. It's about doing advocacy for access to food. So in South LA and in Mar Vista Gardens, and Mar Vista Gardens is actually an important lesson. So we worked with the Housing Authority and had a huge policy win. The Housing Authority of Los Angeles did not allow people in housing projects in Los Angeles to grow food. So there was a kind of, the priority was an orderly lawn. So housing projects, here many of them tend to be low. There's Mar Vista Gardens, people actually have front lawns, and people would plant traditional foods and foods that they couldn't get locally because they didn't have access to grocery stores, or they couldn't afford to buy overpriced, terrible groceries, terrible produce in their local stores, and they were growing it themselves. And the Housing Authority would literally ride a riding lawnmower over the crops in an effort to kind of keep the Mar Vista Gardens looking orderly. So it's priority of orderliness over food access and wellness in communities. So our program, along with some partners, did a lot of advocacy with the Housing Authority to actually change that and to allow people in Los Angeles public housing to be able to use the space that they had to grow food. And we had a huge victory. We won that fight. And so there's been some struggle over the last few years in actually implementing that victory. So policy change is one thing, implementing policy change is often another. And so individual managers of housing projects kind of didn't get the message, and they continued to ride their mowers over people's gardens. And so there's been a lot of work in the last couple of years really about trying to get the policy implemented, and we've had increasing success with that. So Mar Vista Gardens has both individual families growing their own food in the plots of land in front of their homes, but also a pretty great set of community garden work there. And this is, as I said, it's work AFSC has been doing for a number of years in Mar Vista Gardens. And like the farm in South LA, our plan is to essentially, to back out, to have AFSC leave and have the community own it. And we're almost there with Mar Vista Gardens. So I'm pretty happy to say that that work is really very much owned by a group of leaders in Mar Vista Garden, residents who run those gardens themselves, and AFSC provides very little infrastructural support at this point. So that's the food sustainability and wellness work. The youth organizing and civic engagement work is training that we do with a cadre of young people who come in. We do something that's called a Freedom School, and that's done in the summer or sometimes over spring break. And it's a lot of social justice, civil rights, anti-racism training that happens over a fairly short period of time. So a week or 2 weeks, very intensive. And then there is ongoing civic engagement work that is actually done by those young people. So you can see here that there was a group of folks that were young people that were brought in not too long before the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And they went through Freedom School and then actually got very involved in looking at the role of policing in Los Angeles and did a lot of civic engagement work related to that. And so what you see on the right on the slide are some of the participants from that Freedom School, and on the left are some of the civic engagement, some of the actions that they took to try and change policing in Los Angeles. I'm running through this pretty quick because I want to be able to have some time at the end. So AFSC has always done work from very, very, very early days in the organization. We've done work on migrant rights. So this is a picture from very early in the life of the Service Committee, and we still do migrant rights work today. So these are pictures from our San Diego program, which, as I said, is the U.S.-Mexico border program that is really looking at the rights of people to migrate and then what happens after they migrate. And we are also looking in this program and other migration programs with the AFSC, looking at the push factors that push people to migrate and partnering with some of our international programs to look at those push factors. So the U.S.-Mexico border program really works with documentation, advocacy, and leadership development through the building of what we call human rights committees. So this slide here in the center, what you see is a report that got produced. It was released on International Human Rights Day in December, countering ICE's abusive practices with community resiliency. So this report documented what is happening, the ways in which ICE officers actually treat migrants in San Diego County, looks at the resiliency of those migrants, and then it looks at community organizing and advocacy and the role that plays for people who are themselves migrants. So this idea of actually involving people who are impacted in work that makes change in their own lives. So I think we muted again, great. So the thing to say about this documentation is, as I said earlier, when we do research, we don't do research for research's sake. We do research to use that research to make a case. So in San Diego, the documentation work that we do, these reports that we produce, are used as a way to promote particular kinds of social change, mostly through advocacy. So some of it is an advocacy that is about changing people's mind and culture, right? It's about working with folks like you and folks like me who may not know much about this issue and really could benefit from understanding what's really happening with ICE at the San Diego border. But it's also used as a basis for advocacy for legislative change. and policy level change at the state and at the federal level. Somebody is unmuted. If you are unmuted, if you could mute, please. So let me go back to the slide here. So we do the documentation, we use it for advocacy, and we actually involve what we call human rights committees in that advocacy work in San Diego and at other places where AFSC works as well, but I'm using San Diego as an example here. So human rights committees we've been using this model for about 15 years now, maybe actually even a little bit more at this point, where we actually have built these groups around San Diego County that are made up of people who are themselves migrants. And there's a fair amount of training that happens early in that process with things like know your rights training, so people understand what their legal rights are, what their civil rights are, regardless of documentation status, and education around the U.S. political system and how to approach it for change. And those human rights committees actually do social justice organizing in their own communities. And those folks are speaking from their own experience as they do that work. So as one of, in an earlier slide, when it's talking about the use of the report, that's both incredibly useful in terms of the trauma healing that happens for people, where you actually gain some power back because you are advocating on your own behalf, you're regaining your own agency, but it also helps people really understand what the impact of disastrous, inhumane, unjust policies can be, because they're actually hearing from people who are directly impacted by them. I'll move on to the last program I'm going to talk about, looking at the time here. So, and that's the Economic Activism program. And this program is really looking at how to use economic strategy to address the use of corporate power. So one of the things that's actually really important to think about in terms of social change is that the role that corporations play in domestic and international policy setting and breaking has disastrous impacts on communities around the world. And so when we think about advocacy efforts, most social justice folks have, for a lot of our work, it's been focused on government. But the reality is that corporations have an enormous amount of power today, and in some cases, they have more power than governments. So the idea of economic activism work is really looking at addressing corporate power and this idea of exposing, isolating, and reducing corporate complicity in state violence. So the economic activism program actually grew out of our Middle East work, and the program it's around the AFSC. It's based here in our region, in the Bay Area. And as I said, it grew out of the Middle East work, and it grew out of doing work on the occupation, the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and looking at what the kind of boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, but it's actually spread. So the work is really looking now at yes, occupation, but also corporate profiteering and policy, this kind of complicit behavior in terrible policies related to also prisons and borders. So we have been involved in church divestment campaigns, municipal divestment and investment campaigns, and supported student campaigns around the country, where student groups have been really active in getting their universities to invest or divest, mostly divest from particular industries. So this program we do our own research, and we work with partners on research on a whole lot of different companies. And I'll talk in just a second about Investigate, which is actually a website that we very much invite you to visit. It's afsc.investigate. And you can actually search your own investments to see whether you are invested in things that, even if you invest through socially responsible investing processes, are not likely to be picked up. So socially responsible investment looks at things like tobacco and firearms. It doesn't look at things like borders and prisons or occupation. So this screen will allow you, including looking at some mutual funds, it'll allow you to screen your own work and your own investments, and to see whether you have either the possibility of using shareholder activism, or you might think of there are actually some particular companies where we're promoting divestment. So again, this program is doing research on particular corporations, lots and lots of them, and we're also training mostly young people to be justice researchers. And that looks like we had a summer school this past summer. We'll have another one this year. This last year, we trained 20 students from different organizations. They all work with community organizations. So from 20 different community organizations around the country to become researchers around corporate complicity, and to be able to share that information with their social justice movements that they're working with on their campus or in their community. I think that this work is it's actually a particular, I think it's of particular import right now, because the role that corporations play in wreaking havoc on people's lives, and the outsized role that they have in global policy making. So I am going to stop my slides there, and I'm going to see whether anybody has any questions.
Yeah, this is not a question so much as an invitation to expand a little bit. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of youth in the origins of the Roots for Peace programs in Mar Vista and South LA?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that, Phil. So we actually, the food sustainability work grew out of a youth leadership development program. We started working with an alternative high school in Mar Vista Gardens. We worked with alternative high schools in many parts of urban LA. And it was essentially a civic engagement program, like working with young people to think about what was happening in their community and what they would like to change in their community. And so I'll use Mar Vista Gardens as the example. I think it's a really interesting one. They did what's called an asset mapping project, where they took a group of young people around Mar Vista Gardens, not just in the project, but also in the community. And they took a look at what actually existed in Mar Vista Gardens, and actually what didn't exist in Mar Vista Gardens, right? So there's a photography project. They took a lot of pictures. They looked at, grocery stores and liquor stores, and they looked at graffiti, and they looked at what was there. And then they also talked about what they would like to see, what was stopping them from feeling safe in their communities. And Mar Vista Gardens was one of the flashpoints for the Crips and Bloods, early Crips and Blood stuff in LA. So there's this enormous, tragically beautiful mural in Mar Vista Gardens that has the names of all of these young people who've been killed in gang violence. And so we actually heard an interest in gardening. So we worked with the alternative program, and it was fascinating because it was like in this kind of preschool setting, and they had a sandbox in the back, which they sort of turned into a garden. They turned it into a pond. They planted a bunch of stuff. We had a relationship with a restaurant who was buying the organic stuff that the kids were growing. But it really became a project that allowed young people to take a look at what was missing from their communities. And also, I mean, I remember having a conversation with, it was probably the second year of the program, having a conversation with one of the young people who said that they didn't feel safe walking from their house to the school. They didn't feel that, but they had all of these feelings of not feeling safe anywhere. But the one place that they really felt safe was actually in that garden. And this idea that we were able to work with young people to realize this vision. It was not our vision. We did not go in to start a farming project or a garden project. We went in to work with young people to say, what is your experience? What do you need? And this is what they said. And the interesting thing for me is now, 12 years later, more than that, the project still exists, and we're now in the second generation of young people who are coming through it. And that, it's not because AFSC had a brilliant idea to plant a garden in a community, in a continuing education program. It was because young people themselves wanted to do it.
It's amazing to hear you where you've come from and how the vision has transposed. I remember visiting the parking lot with youth and then coming back and seeing the garden grow. So I just, and what's happening now, even with the, and working with Ceasefire and everything and giving them ideas now, they need that. The youth need that. So I just am so happy to hear the growth and everything in Mar Vista and downtown LA. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we have Rose, Anthony, and Carol Francis. Rose Leibowitz.
This is out of left field. My father worked for your organization during the Second World War, kind of as an ambulance driver. And while you were on, I kind of remembered, now whether you can see this if I hold it up, but this document that he has that is, I presume it was from there anyway, it's devoted to the people that worked at the clinic that he worked at in Syria under the auspices of the Friends Service Committee. And I just wondered, it's a historic document, as you could see when I held it up, it's not in good shape. If there's anybody, any historian or anybody who would like it.
Yes, Rose, yes. We have an archive at the AFSC. It's
okay.
The AFSC, if you're ever in Philadelphia, visit the AFSC archives because they're people use them from all over the world. They're remarkable, not just about the history of the AFSC work, but the history of social justice work and work in supporting people through war. Absolutely, Rose. So I'll put my email address in the chat. If you could send me an email, I'll work with you to get it.
Great.
Thank you.
And we have Anthony and Carol Francis. Anthony Manousis, question or comment?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I was just so much you covered, Sonia. It was really fantastic how comprehensive your overview was. I was intrigued by the Freedom School, and I thought about the fact that ICUJP has a peace camp that we support with Susan Stauffer, and I'm just hoping that maybe there's some way that the FSC and Susan can connect and maybe get to help each other work. And Susan said she'd like to speak, but she can't raise her hand because because she's a host. So be sure to call on Susan.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Her hand is up now.
Michael helped me figure out where it is. It's hidden.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So we have Carol Francis, and then we'll hear from Susan. Carol Francis.
Yes, thank you so much. I want to say that I was introduced to Quakerism really as a student at Whittier College, and later as an activist became aware of AFSC, but I always thought of it as simply a service committee, like the name says. And the moment that you said systemic change, and later I mean, that was the greatest jolt I had. And then you talk about corporate power supplanting political power. And I mean, this is really exciting to me. Could you talk more about how this applies to the Middle East or anywhere outside of Mar Vista and South Central LA? Or Central LA?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for the prompt there, Carol. So I'm always happy to talk about Middle East work because it's the thing that brought me really, it's my own organizing background and it's what brought me to AFSC. So AFSC's work in the Middle East actually really began as service, right? So in 1947, we got asked by the predecessor of the UN to work with refugees. We set up the first refugee camp in Gaza pretty soon after we got out because we realized that was likely to be an ongoing situation and we were not interested in that. But our work actually in the Middle East is almost all about structural change now, not about service. So there's a Palestine youth program that's doing kind of very similar sorts of civic engagement work with young people, where they're doing this kind of community survey about what needs to happen in their communities in the West Bank and in Gaza, and they're doing civic engagement projects around community improvement. But there's systemic change work also in terms of, in Israel, we actually have a program working with conscientious objectors and looking at supporting them because I think most of you, any of you who work on Middle East issues know that that conscientious objectors get slated for prison in Israel. And so really trying to look at how you support conscientious objectors, how you build a culture that supports conscientious objection, how you build a culture that supports in opposition to occupation. And we're working in Jordan. We do still have some service work. We've done some support work for Syrian refugees in the largest Syrian refugee camp, which is in Jordan. So we've done some support work, but we've also done training programs for people who are refugees or internally displaced people in the Middle East so that they have livelihood training or that they actually have some training to be able to do advocacy in the systems in which they now find themselves. And we have a long history of actually working in Jordan, where Palestinian refugees, Iraqi refugees, Syrian refugees, Jordan is the place where people, and it's just got an enormous refugee community. So a lot of support work for people who have been displaced in the Middle East. And so the origins of the service committee really are around having provided the service opportunities or either an avenue for people to provide service or to receive service. That's really the origins of the service committee. But our work has evolved over the years because I think we really understand that the need for service is based on all of these unjust systems. And if you don't address the systems, you will forever be putting Band-Aids on very serious problems. So that's really the work of the service committee. And that started to be something that the service committee did decades and decades ago. We did work with people who were interned in Japanese internment camps and some service work related to that, but we also did advocacy for ending internment. So it's really this idea of you can't just put a Band-Aid over the problem. You also can't ignore the bleeding, right? So there is this kind of the balance that you have to reach. But if you don't address the system, if you don't address the broken system, you're forever after going to be trying to bandage it.
This was very exciting for me to hear. Of course, we're very much in alignment with the Friends and AFSC and all of the work that you do, but particularly this work in LA. And I'm sorry to say I didn't know you had the South LA Community Garden going on very near to where we're located. And I went on to look at the website when you were you were mentioning it. And I hope we can make contact, as Anthony suggested, both for that and then also for the Freedom School that you mentioned, because I think, you know, we started with young kids, and then we've been growing over the years as the kids grew up. So now we have youth and then young adult leaders and all of that. And we just kind of do our internal training in leadership and the peacemaking and justice making principles and process. But it would be great to connect with that and see if we can find a way to do that. And one final comment is I also love the idea of the community mapping, because I've done that before and things, but I don't know why it just didn't occur to me. We should do that with them. We talk
Do it with
about
the
it
kids.
and we build, especially now because we're on Zoom. Everything is on Zoom and our programs are online right now. And we're building what is a healthier community, you know, with materials that we gave out to the kids in their house, you know, outlining and drawing and building. But this would be great too. So thank you.
Yeah, you're quite welcome. The director of the LA program is finishing up some maternity leave right now. She'll be back next month. And so Susan, reach out to me and I'll put you in contact with her. Krista Gonzalez is her name. And she's terrific. So I'd really like to connect you to her. And I really encourage you to do the asset mapping with your kids. And you can do it virtually really well, because it doesn't have to be a group activity. So all they need is a smartphone with a camera and, you know, a walk around the neighborhood, depending how young they are with a parent or not. And then they can do a Zoom collection of photos of what they see and talk about what are the assets in their community? What do they have? What do they need? And you can do that virtually really well as a kind of independent project. We've done it with groups of kids literally like on a field trip, but it works just fine. It would work just fine individually.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. And yeah, I will reach out to you and get Krista, you said was her name?
Crystal.
Get her contact info. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So I think we're going to turn it over to Sterling for a commercial announcement.
Well, what I'll say is part of my job is just working with folks who want to know more about what AFSC does. I heard about this meeting because I was emailing with Ed Fisher a couple days ago, and he said, well, actually, Sonia is coming to talk to us tomorrow if you want to hop on. So that's how I ended up here. And yeah, so what I do is if you ever have any questions about any of AFSC's programs anywhere in the world or in your community, I can be a point person who connects you to those programs or just tells you stories about them. I always say our program staff is very good at what they do, but they're not really great at stopping and writing about the programs. So I kind of collect stories and share them with folks. So I'll put my email in the chat. And if you ever have any questions or if there's anything I can do, you know, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Sterling. And we'll look for your email address in the chat column. And the next people on the list that I can see are Vida, Paul, and Dave. And so Vida, question or comment?
Yes, thank you so much, Sonia. My question's a little bit like Susan's, because Mar Vista Gardens is in our area. I'm in Culver City, and we've worked off and on, but we've never made that the church has never made that connection quite in the way it should with Mar Vista Gardens. And for a while we were doing a food handout with farmers markets, leftover things, but we've been a little hobbled with the pandemic. We can't open the church, and so we've had to sort of shift around. But as this pandemic winds down, I hope, we'll be able to start again. And I'd like to see us have more community relations. Culver City High School has students that are very active. And because we're kind of a small town, it's easy, not easy, but possible to work with the city council and get things done. So I'm thinking, I don't know if Sterling would be my contact or if somebody else that our social justice team should be in touch with.
Yeah, I can be the contact, and I can always get you in contact with the right people.
Thank
For
you.
any- yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to hear next from Paul Phillips, and I'd like to take the liberty of introducing Paul to people who may not have attended last Friday's forum. Paul and his wife Hope do a lot of work in and around Africa, where people are suffering and there are wars, and the wars are related to corporate and advanced industrial societies' mining interests in that area. And his talk was very enlightening, and I hope it will be online soon. So Paul, with that introduction, do you have a question or comment for Sonia?
Thanks, Dave. Yes, for Sonia and I believe it's Mr. Spence. I just wanted to offer my help. My wife and I do work in an extremely impoverished region of the Great Lakes region of Africa. We teach a microbial-based farming method called Korean natural farming. And we used to live in LA, now we live in Central California. We're waiting out the pandemic. If you have some young people that would be interested in learning a very cost-effective and very effective way of growing, please have them reach me. I've sent you both a private message. Anyone else on this call, if you're involved in farming projects or anything where you're trying to help poor people become food stable, we would be more than happy to share what we're learning.
I really appreciate that, Paul. I copied your message from the chat into something else so that we can share it with Crystal, who runs the LA program when she returned. So I appreciate that. I do. A lot of the soil remediation work for that location has actually already been done, but that's not the only place in Los Angeles that would need soil remediation for any of this food sustainability wellness work. So thank you for that.
And thank you, Paul. I have a quick question, and then I see a hand, Teresa Basile. I see a hand, except it's a slightly different color from the other hand. So maybe you can tell us how you achieved that. My question for Sonia, quick question: do you have a mission in Gaza? And if you do, how do your people get into Gaza?
So we do have a program in Gaza. We have an office in Gaza, and our people get in because they are already in. So the staff from the Gaza program are Gazans. And so, you know, one of the AFSC, this Zoom business, the electronic communication thing, AFSC has been in this game for a while. So we actually have most of our communication with folks who are in Gaza or in Myanmar or in places that are difficult to get in and out of. It actually happens electronically. So the Gaza staff gets supported. We do that way, but we do have the regional director for the Middle East. It's Palestinian, and he can apply for and get permits to get into Gaza. I have applied for and gotten a permit to get into Gaza. It's difficult, but it does happen. So it's tenuous, right? It's a difficult situation to get people in and out. The reality is that the way that we can work best is that the people who actually staff the program are themselves Gazans. And so we don't have to worry about bringing people who are foreigners in and out. they're local, they know the community, they're well connected, and we have a lot of electronic communication with them. It's hard. We want to be able to bring our staff together, and even when we have meetings in the Middle East in places that are, Jordan is kind of neutral territory, but it's still, we never know until right before folks are gonna travel whether they're actually going to be able to travel. So we have backup plans for Gaza and West Bank all the time.
Thank you. And Teresa, do you have a question or a comment?
I just wanted to lift up real quick one of the economic campaigns that AFSC staff are leading, and maybe Sonia will have something to say about it too. There's a campaign, Boycott Pillsbury, that Dalit Baum is leading, and it's not very well known yet, but there are a number of our faith-based groups and others who are in a coalition supporting it, and we've been meeting regularly about it. Pillsbury has a factory in one of the settlements, and with the logo and name of Pillsbury right over it. So they've been chosen as a target, a focus for a campaign that we hope will become national, maybe international. So you'll be hearing more about that, hopefully. Boycott Pillsbury. I can put a couple of links in the chat if anybody wants to know more.
Thank you, Teresa. And at this point, I don't see any other hands. Does someone who is not familiar with the system, does somebody want to raise a hand on screen oh, that's great. Thank you for that shot of the.
That's our staff person, by the way. That's one of our staff people in the Pillsbury Doughboy costume.
Noam
you can see his face peeking out there. That's Noam Perry telling you that he made that pie with no Pillsbury product.
Thank you, Sonia.
Question and a comment. First of all, I appreciate it. I really love farming. I am a Salvadorian to become a farmer here in the United States also. But I want to ask to the friends about if they have a program in El Salvador.
Do we have it? Yes, we do have a program in El Salvador. We do.
Okay.
It's a,
yes.
So I don't know. Sterling, do you know much about the program in El Salvador? I don't actually.
I don't know a lot about it. I know it's a youth program in San Salvador.
Okay, I just really want to know because I really want to push myself a nonprofit here in Los Angeles, and I really want to see exactly how can I help my people there. You know, I live 3 years here in the United States, but I really definitely need to know how can I engage and do work in El Salvador.
So if you reach out to me, I'll send you more information on that program that we have there.
I will do that. It's as parents, right?
Yep, at afsc.org.
Very good. Thank you very much.